Welcome everyone to class 13 of our study, and we're in chapter 13 as we begin today. And we're getting near the end of the book, but not near the end of the importance of what we've been discussing. We still have some controversy to navigate in Paul's understanding of the new people of God. So I thought we might start with the reading of a text from the book of Ephesians. So maybe I could ask Gail if she'll read chapter 2, verses 19 through 22 of the book of Ephesians. Chapter 2, 19 through 22. Now, the context, of course, is Paul speaking to a group of Gentile believers in Ephesus and of their new relationship to God's people Israel. That's the context.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Okay. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, having been built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Yeshua Messiah himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit.
Yeah. So in that text, Paul is teaching the Ephesian community that they are now part of God's kingdom. God's kingdom, which means that they are citizens of a new kingdom, not the kingdom of this world, but the kingdom of heaven. As such, being citizens of that kingdom, they have new responsibilities and new relationships with each other, yes, but with the Jewish people as well. Now, I want to use that as a starting point for the discussion which Paul now has with the Roman community in chapter 13. So let's turn to our notes and dive right into this. So if I could ask Faith if she would read the note, the verses 1 through 7 to 13 and the notes.
Do you want me to read the verse from scripture first, or just read from here?
The scripture first,
Yes.
so that we're all read
from here. Okay.
Yeah.
Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. This portion seems a strange digression from the subject Paul was addressing in the previous passages and will pick up again in verse 8. So one has to ask the question, what authorities is Paul addressing and asking the Roman congregation to be in subjection to? Traditional interpretation understands this portion to mean that believers have an obligation to subject themselves to temporal law and its leaders because they are ordained by God. This can be something of a conundrum. Does God put evil governments into place? Those same governments that will soon persecute these same Romans, not for rebellion or insurrection or other lawbreaking, but because they believe in the very God who supposedly put these leaders in place. Does God expect his people to obey without question these authorities? That cannot be. Consider Acts 4, 1 through 22. In this case, the apostles defied the authorities, saying, and when they had summoned them, they commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Yeshua. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. Or we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. So at least in this case, we are not bound to human governments. But if Paul is not addressing civil governments and rulers, what might he be addressing? Mark Nanos, in his book, The Mystery of Romans, proposes this. This chapter, Romans 13, 1 through 7, Christian obedience to synagogue authority, seeks to take up the challenge laid down in my approach to Romans thus far, namely, to recognize that Paul and the Christians addressed in Rome understood themselves to be working within the boundaries of Judaism and the Jewish community of Rome. I now apply the implications of this paradigm to the interpretation of Romans 13, 1 through 7. I will assume that Paul addressed the Christian Gentiles in Rome within the context of their association with the synagogues for the obedience of the new faith by instructing them to subordinate themselves to the institutional requirements of the synagogues, in addition to the ethical and purity halacha that had been developed for righteous Gentiles worshiping in the midst of the congregation of Israel. Continue.
I know.
The implications for this interpretation are far-reaching. We will explore this possibility in our discussion of this portion.
All right. So what do you think about that? I mean, the idea that we are subject to governance. The idea that, for instance, it says, so there is no authority except from God, and those who exist are established by God. Now, if you're a history buff like I am, the divine right of kings was one of the most destructive doctrines in the history of humankind. And it took something like the French Revolution and, the royal razor, if you know what I mean,
Yep.
to get rid of this whole idea of divine right of kings. Is there a divine right of government? Do you think God cares who gets elected in November? Is God going to lose his mind if Donald Trump becomes the next president, or this, what's her name? Kamala Harris becomes president? Are all of his plans going to be thrown into the air? What does Paul mean by this?
Doesn't scripture say man casts the ballot, but God determines the outcome?
No, I never heard that before.
I thought I heard that. Oh, I thought I read it.
I know. Where'd you read that? I mean, God doesn't have anything to do with the elections unless he's a Democrat or a Republican. As far as I'm concerned. I mean, so what can Paul mean? Why would Paul be concerned about this subject? Rabbi Carl.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of, he doesn't really mention kings here per se, does he?
No,
It's authority in general. I think Paul has a very exaggerated view of authority and its place, which is, you know, I think it's problematic because there's nothing here about accountability except what everybody says. Well, I'm accountable to God, not to you, sort of thing. So I think he's emphasizing, perhaps to an extreme in the way he says it, that we are to be subject to all governing authorities because they are appointed by God, plain and simple. I don't think the issues are elections or how they come into office. It seems that he's saying that you are to be subject to them. And there couldn't be any authority even, except from God. It's not possible, according to Paul there in verse 2 or 1 rather. No authority except from God. So it doesn't matter how they're elected or come into office or whether there's a revolution or anything else. That seems to be what he's saying without an exception. Now, that's not necessarily the way it's interpreted in history because, it's interpreted that way by those who are in authority, but not necessarily by others, especially when you get a scholarly class that's not necessarily in authority. They won't necessarily see it the same way. So sorry for taking so much time.
no. Perfectly all right. Any other thoughts?
What about dictators?
How about dictators?
Like what's happening in Venezuela?
Venezuela. Listen, we can the Nazis.
Yeah.
I mean, we can go on and on and on and on and on.
Stalin, Hitler.
Stalin, Hitler, yeah.
I have a question on
See, we all have somebody.
I have a question on Nanos's interpretation. The idea that he's referring to synagogue authority,
Yeah,
because he specifically refers to the sword, which I suppose it's metaphorical, but
Nano says in his somewhere that it is. He means it metaphorically. Metaphorically, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, but it seems okay. So that seems a little facile, a little bit of an easy way out. That he's talking about synagogue authority. He's alluding to the death penalty, which is not part of the package. There, it weakens that argument. What's that?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, in other words, we could be talking about temporal authorities here. That's a possibility. But why would Paul be concerned for these people? See, here's the problem I have. What my conundrum is that remember what Paul's original task was? Going back all the way to chapter 1 of this thing, he says, my job is to bring about the obedience of faith among the nations, right? The obedience of faith. So with these people being brought into a new kingdom under the God of Israel, their life as Roman citizens is going to change radically, because as Roman citizens, they will be required to, for instance, do obeisance to Roman authorities. I mean, like, make offerings to Caesar, to the Roman gods, and so on and so forth. Are they still expected to do that? And what would be the penalty for a Gentile who refused to follow those rules? Wouldn't he be considered an insurrectionist? Right? Yes, right. Rabbi Carl.
No, a Gentile, basically, according to Leviticus 19 and some other scriptures and also tradition, a Gentile does not become a member of the community simply because they're living in the community. To actually be a member of the covenant community, certain things have to happen. And one of the things is you do have to be obedient to the Torah, with the exception of one commandment. It's required. So whatever the penalties would be for Jews, they would be for Gentiles too in that environment.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if a Gentile is part of God's people now, as Paul has been arguing, I think, in the letter to the Romans, would they still be allowed to make offerings to Caesar? Would that be acceptable?
I don't think so. Now they have to change.
Well, they usually have to,
They have a
if
new
they had
way.
to make, if that was everybody, then everybody had to do it, regardless of its religious significance for them.
Is that the equivalent of paying taxes on?
No, that's not true. Listen, history, when Caesar and Pompey were vying for control of Rome, the Jews supported Pompey. I'm sorry, supported Caesar. As a result, Julius Caesar had an edict written in which Jews were exempted from emperor worship and other idolatrous practices. He gave them a special exemption. That exemption is still in effect all through this period. So Jews
You're sure
now have
about that?
to do it. Problem comes when Gentiles who are now part of the, as Paul would say, Jewish community, are not doing acts of worship to emperors. I mean, that's another ball game altogether, don't you think?
Mhm. Yeah.
Could I kind of answer it in
Yeah.
a way? And it's in scripture. The only thing I could think of is Naaman. When he
Naaman.
was healed and he was going back to his land, he said to Elisha, I am going to bring the sand from Israel back with me, so that when I stand with my king in the house of the God, I will put the sand down and I will kneel on the sand. So know that I'm not worshiping that God. In my heart, I'm worshiping your God, but I have to bow with my king in the house of his God.
Well, he was still back.
Yeah.
So, Rabbi Tony,
Yeah.
I think the tendency, and this has been the tendency in the history of Christian theology, is to universalize this and to make this suddenly we're doing a right turn, and there's a this is not a letter, this is a unique theological concept that is being portrayed. Make sure you obey the government and pay your taxes and do what you're supposed to do and do everything with done legal right. But this is a letter, and there is these chapters where divisions were not here, and there was a consistent line of thought which Paul is holding to, and that is, at least from my understanding, which would also be the one of all the most of the sources, especially Nanos, is that this is dealing with the liminal status of Gentiles and their sense of who they might be and the upheaval of the sort of the Jewish rootedness of their faith. So understanding that this is conceptualized within the governmental authority are the guild within which the synagogue is established. So if this was about Roman government, it couldn't be without the existence of talking about Caesar and the establishment of Roman government under Caesar. It's not talking about that. I mean, there's been no mention of that. I think what it tends to establish here is the idea of, and this is why I think Nanos leans towards the synagogue authorities. This is, don't try, and especially if you think about Romans 9 through 11 as a guiding principle here, and then the situation that you talked about with the situation of the weaker brother and all of these, they're all very much related and tied in. I think Paul is just addressing the status of the Gentiles and perhaps their sense of discontent or uneasiness with the Jewish rootedness. I think if that were the way that we were reading this, we shouldn't continue on sort of trying to collapse all of history and now equate this with a universal principle for how we treat government. There's one other thing that's very interesting that could just is when it says that this has been those that exist, talking about the authority structure, and have been set in order by God. The only governmental scripture in which the basis of this, which is the Hebrew scripture, has established authority, is about the authority of, where it talks about that is the authority of Israel under God. So I think that this is following your line of covenantal thinking, that this is about the structure of Israel, not about and where the Gentiles fit in into this covenant, not necessarily about governments in general or Roman law. That would be my take on this.
If something like that isn't right, then what could be?
What could, well, let's think about it. Remember the story of Yeshua and the coin?
Mhm.
Right.
Some people come to him and say, should we pay tax or not? Right?
Yep.
So Yeshua says, hey, get me a coin. They show him a coin, and there's an image on the coin. He says, whose image is this? And he says, it's Caesar. So Yeshua says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, render to God what belongs to God. Right? So pretty much that's all Yeshua has to say about government. If they have a tax, pay the tax. Just to obey the law and do, and be a good citizen. But he doesn't talk about divine rights or anything like that. He just says, don't get yourself in trouble with that. So yeah,
I think the tendency is to play down one of the actual emphases here, and that is the emphasis on authority and the God-givenness of authority. And he says all authority. He's not just saying the specific. So in a sense, Paul is the one who's universalizing it, not as interpreters. He doesn't say, now listen, there is such a thing as conscientious objection, in which you disobey a law that you consider, unrighteous, but you're then willing to suffer the penalty for that. You don't try to escape the penalty, and that's something in most countries have a law like that. But you're not, in doing that, denying the authority of the government to draft you if you're a conscientious objector. You're saying that you're asking for a special designation. And I think what Paul is saying here is that regardless of what you do and regardless of your circumstance, I find it hard to believe that he's talking about wrath and fear in the synagogue here. But whatever it is, Paul consistently through Romans has a very, very high view, almost an absolute view of authority. And I think this is just part of the way he viewed things.
Okay.
You may disagree with me. That's fine. Obviously we're all welcome to disagree with each other. you obviously wouldn't feel you don't agree with me, maybe that I have the freedom to disagree with Paul.
Well, Paul has a tendency, though, towards leaning towards the hyperbolic. And even in terms here of, thinking of Fogomai or the fear, it's not, I don't think he's really his example of talking about the sword. The sword is, again, it's a literary example. I just don't think he's really talking about by anybody about fear of death. There's something else that's really could change
No,
it.
I don't think it's death either. I think it says basically if you do
getting,
good.
Private conversation here.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Let's let the others, Rabbi Russ, I know you wanted
I'm
to
sorry.
get in here.
Well, supporting Carl's reading, I think, I think this does fit in the context. This does fit in the flow of Romans 12 that's already been established, where Paul is telling us to live at peace. Actually, I think a real key, verse 18, if it is possible, as far as depends on you, live peaceably with all.
Yeah.
Don't avenge yourselves. And then verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And that, I think, sets the stage for what he's saying about authority, that submit to authority and seek to overcome evil with the good of your submission, as it were. But for me, a saving grace of the argument is where he says, if it is possible, as far as depends on you. So he's laying out an ideal, but acknowledging that it's not always going to be possible. So part of that ideal is submitting humbly to authority and overcoming its evil with good. But it's not always possible. There may be, times when you have to object, when you have to refuse, resist even. But resisting authority is not the same as saying no authority is valid. It's not anarchy. It's principled resistance.
All right.
I think it fits in the whole flow of 12 and 13.
Sorry.
Isn't that the point of the Second Amendment? If we come across tyrannical government, that we have the rights to defend ourselves?
That's an American concept. Nobody else has a Second Amendment.
But on the other side of that, I also see like the Egyptians had to submit themselves to the authority of Joseph, who was a Hebrew, and a lot of
But he was given his authority by Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Right.
Which was like the higher authority, but you can also make an argument that God put him in that place to reach that point.
In Joseph's case, I think he made a strong case for that. But that's a specific case. If we assume that Paul is not specifically talking about temporal governments, although temporal governments could be included in Paul's admonition, not, to be cooperative with them insofar as one is able to be. Could he also be addressing the issue of synagogue authority, as Nanos is suggesting? What do you think? Do you think Nanos is onto something?
I think he is.
Yeah, I think he absolutely is. I just don't think that that Paul would be wasting his time talking about a group of Christians in Rome thinking about that they were going to overthrow the Roman government, or that they were going to. I think he really is talking about their place, and their place in this is he's constantly addressing where they fit into the structure of Israel, which in its most temporal form is seen within the synagogal structure in Rome. There's something when he starts off and he talks about the governing authorities, there's then I think, a very confusing verb to order things, tasso, which maybe Brandon, I think this is an aorist text, which some people would see as but I could be wrong. It could be punctiliar or non-punctiliar. The question is, are you saying that's been set in order, or will be continue to be set in order, or God will continue to maintain? And that to me is somewhat reminiscent against of Proverbs. I think it's Proverbs 23 that talks about that all thrones are established. It's either 16 or 23 that all throne is established by God. And the question becomes the idea that God will tear down any throne that is not just. So this may not be talking about any structure, but just the permanence of any structure, but whether or not it remains in existence is in God's hands.
Mhm. All right.
By the way, if I explain what I meant by punctiliar means that it has a final, it's final. Non-punctiliar
Yeah.
means it has an ongoing essence to it. And that's been a debate about this particular tense. Different, because Koine Greek is such a small little, sample. Anyway, it seems very uncertain.
Right.
Also, there's something, again, if somebody knows, that I found very weird here. Every translation I see translates, it talks about to paying taxes, and then it says about the revenue, but the Greek is telos, which is clearly not revenue. What does that mean? Why is that choice of translation? And what could it possibly mean using the word telos, which is earlier in destruction in terms of a goal or a completion?
Right.
I don't know. That's a good question. I was actually unaware of that. Do you have any?
I have no thoughts about what that could possibly mean in any other, telos could be a goal or an intention.
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is just, I'm trying to look things up here in the Little Scott dictionary, the big classics dictionary that we've got for Greek. One of the definitions for telos is a magistracy or an office. And so that might also be another thing, whether that's taxes or whether that again goes with these other things, giving honor, respect, fear, etc. So just a small
helpful.
thing. Yeah, I have other questions. And it could be other obligations as well, including taxes. But I don't know. I feel like we're kind of like diving into what does this line mean, or this word, or this verse, and I'm kind of curious. The comment started with, "This seems like a digression," and and I was puzzling over this, looking at the beginning of 13. We don't have any of the usual kinds of just logical connections that we get in a lot of these other places.
Yeah.
And I'm following, I'm thinking, well, then maybe there's not such a distinct break where our chapter 13 is. Obviously, neither Paul nor Tertius wrote the numbers in here. And so I was looking at this and like, what possibly could be continuing and connecting. And I was thinking last week, Rabbi Russ, you kind of helpfully suggested we sort of place a colon after love being not hypocritical, colon, and the rest of these being sort of examples or expansions of that idea. And end of 12 being, don't take vengeance upon yourself, repay evil with good, and you'll sort of heap coals on your enemy's head, right? We got the same thing when Paul says in 13:2, somebody who is rebellious, somebody who is opposed to being ordered by authority, right? He basically says you're going to receive judgment upon yourself. And I thought, well, that's not exactly the same thing, but it's a similar kind of concept, and maybe this is continuing. Maybe this sort of extended meditation on how to be under authority might be a continuation of what it means not to be hypocritical in love. And I think if, trying that out as an idea, I'm not saying that I like it, agree with it, or, I could easily be dissuaded if I get a better explanation, that idea is then, do you do things out of fear? Or do you do things because love makes you accept certain things? And as he proceeds, he gets to this idea of, give what is owed to each. But then he's going to come back in the next verse and say, don't owe anybody anything except for loving one another. And citing, I'm trying to read this as one connected whole, because I don't see it as I don't see it as completely connected, and so I'm looking for the connection there. That's I'll leave the rest of that the weeds.
His connections are often very obvious, and here they're not. But what the context of the end of chapter 12 is, it seems to me, is within the community of belief.
Right.
Everything that is said has to do with one's relationship with insiders, with people who are inside the community, not those outside. So for him to all of a sudden start talking about what's going on the outside, seems discordant, to me.
Yeah,
It throws me, all of a sudden, I feel jerked around, so I don't know what he means. That's all I'm saying. Yes, Rabbi Russ.
Well, could the connection point be in 12, 19 and 20, when Paul says, don't avenge yourselves, if your enemy is hungry, feed them, etc. So that's probably not the insiders that he's envisioning as the enemies. He's probably talking about outsiders there. And then again, continuing the thinking, the application of do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good, that he applies that even to our relationship to the authorities. They're outside, they may not be good, but overcome their evil with good. And so there's the continuity flowing from 12 into 13. And it's helped by Paul admitting, I mentioned all this before, back in verse 18, he's saying, if it's possible, live peaceably. And so he's laying out this ideal of submitting to government as a rule, in the hope of overcoming evil with the good of your humble submission. But it's not always going to work out.
But what does that do then to Nano's idea of this being about synagogue authority? I think it throws a monkey wrench into Nano's idea about synagogue authority.
You know, but the verse that Rabbi Russ just quoted is a quote from the Beatitudes. And it is, again, even if we were going to go back, and Paul, of course, is very free and liberal with his interpretations, but he is referencing something that would have been largely, even when they talked about, Yeshua spoke about enemies, he would have still been talking internal. Internal to Israel, not speaking outside. I still think this is all sort of contained within Israel. And I think this, and within the synagogal system, I think is the framework for which understanding Israel here.
Yeah.
Brendan.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, I think one thing that might be in support of that is, yes, the quote in 20 is also, from Proverbs. This, ha'ethrasu, your enemy, sounds like it could call back the discussion where he's trying to set these Gentiles straight in 9 through 11. And at one point he says, so in a certain respect, he's talking about other Jews who aren't, following Yeshua are echroi to you Gentiles that he's addressing. And so he's saying, sort of in this current moment that he is addressing, he's talking about people who are living within a community which includes people that they disagree with. And I think that would support Nanos's point, which I find appealing, but I don't find it completely satisfying with the way that some of the language in the beginning of 13 works. But I can see why that would be the case. I'm also not sure that we have to pick one or the other, that it may be that it's, like we've seen earlier, things that are to be developed, cultivated within the community, habits, dispositions, ways of relating to each other within the community, then are also ways of then, sort of spilling out beyond the community. And I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I find that might actually help connect not only 12 and 13, but possibly connect what in the world 12 and 13 have to do with what just came before them in the letter. Like how does this how do all of these sort of ethical applications, the parenetic section, sort of follow from what he's been arguing up through chapter 11.
Is a portion scripture. Sorry for.
Yeah, sorry. Technical lingo. Apologies.
Yeah, right. Okay. This has been really, really interesting. We don't have to solve in order to it could be either or both. I think Paul, I think I personally think that Nanos does want to address the issue of this community's relationship with the existing Jewish community of Rome, that he sees a connection between them and sees them as part of the people of God. This becomes more evident when we get into the discussion in chapter 14 on the weak and strong, which we'll save for when we get there. So we can continue to move on in this, just so that we don't get too far bogged down in all of it. But I see Rabbi Carl's hand up. So Rabbi Paul?
Yeah, yeah. I just want to add this thought. The history of basically authoritarian or authority-related religious groups is not necessarily a happy one. And many of us have been in congregations where authority was overused or was overbearing. In other words, it's a real thing. It's a real thing that people can be afraid of, even if there's no sword involved. So it's a real thing. And sometimes this view of authority is taken up among believing congregations. I've been in a couple of them where you did fear not whether you were doing wrong, but whether you were doing what the authorities wanted. And I think that's an issue that Paul maybe is not aware of in the same way as we do after a couple of thousand years of history and also our personal history. Certainly nobody really succeeded in telling Paul what to do.
Yeah, so in that context, how to understand verse 5, therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. I have no idea what that means. In the context,
because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't violate your conscience.
Yeah, I think there's an overarching idea, which I think Yeshua would be in agreement with, which is that we submit ourselves to authorities, knowing that we are ultimately justified by God, just as he submitted himself when he did not have. So maybe this is playing in Paul's mind as he addresses this issue of submission. Because, I mean, the whole end of the second of chapter 12 is about submitting to one another. He broadens that out to a larger set. In this case, either synagogue authorities or temporal government or both. So we are to be justified by God and to live humbly before all men. That itself, that's a new, that will be new for at least Romans 2, I believe.
Can I supplement something? I
Yeah.
just gotta add,
Okay.
I'm gonna add this. Maybe, in a secular or sacred, kind of, community or environment. And I'm thinking, if you have the discernment, at times you think like if you have to surrender to authorities in a sense of moral, if like law and order, you don't want to violate, let's say you're taking, you pass traffic light, you're gonna pay. So, and when something correlates to God's law, and when Yeshua said, render to God what's due to him, no matter who's the authority, I don't care if it's Kim Jong-un in North Korea or wherever, when it's something surpasses God's, you have to abide to his laws, you have to worship and honor him. Whoever the man may be, you may have to be martyred or persecuted.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you see at the end all the disciples, what happened to them.
Yeah.
They would not have to. Some of them were thrown to jail. Somebody would tell me, okay, you gotta worship me. Look at what Daniel, he did not obey whatever to bow to this statue. So in this case, they will kill us. We have to obey to God, whatever he says, and a law in our own conscience. We're thinking, okay, if it's something that it has to align to the God, the creator, first and foremost. Otherwise, one day we could expect, maybe they'll say we can't worship anymore, we cannot commune anymore. Maybe the government, who knows, in 5 years from now, they may come up with a law. And then what you gonna do? Then let it be. That's how I see the chapters, and
Yeah.
that's how I interpreted this.
Something come to my mind, the conversation between Yeshua and Pilate. And Pilate says, I have authority to give, to release you or take your life away, right? And Yeshua asks, answer, you don't have nothing, no authority if it's not was given to you.
Right.
So it means
Over him.
Over him, yes. But how can you interpret, explain this position of the pilot in this case?
Well, again, Yeshua also said, no one takes my life, I surrender.
Right.
He has the ultimate authority. So Pilate had no authority over him. The only reason Pilate could hold him in this case was because Yeshua submitted to it. He submitted himself to it. He didn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
He had the choice not to do something. So again, I say that Paul, if I read the whole context of 12, 11, 12, 13, it's all about submitting ourselves to one another and to others as well, if in the end we understand that we are justified by God no matter what happens. See, I can freely submit myself to other authorities so long as I don't violate God's law, because God will vindicate me as he vindicated Yeshua himself.
Well, that's interesting because it kind of provides a segue into the weak and the strong.
Yes. We'll get there. We'll get there, I promise. Someday. Let's continue with chapter 13. So let's see. Can I have you, Judy, read verses 8 to 10 in my comment?
Okay. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this, quote, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, end of quote. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Once again, Paul appeals to unity within the congregation at Rome. Particularly interesting here is Paul's appeal to the Torah. Love is the fulfillment of the law. Of course, we know that this is a teaching straight from Yeshua. Obviously, the standard for how the congregation at Rome is to treat one another is set in the Torah, not in some abstract form of Christian love.
Yeah. So again, this sums up what I just said, so I don't think I need to repeat myself. Any other comments before we move on? No? Okay.
Just
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just no, I'm just wondering, this is something that is curious because of the way the syntax works in the Greek. So let me see if I can just sort of explain. In verse 7, where there's this list of, basically, give X to somebody to whom X is due, basically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It sort of repeats that. That same kind of construction shows up in verse 10 that love, instead of does, it does not do evil to, and then it uses the same kind of it uses the same kind of construction, like to, it's not directly to a neighbor, but it seems to suggest to the one who is owed neighborliness, because of the way that the cases work there. And so what I'm curious about is, it seems like, as because this is a discussion of the different commandments, and all the commandments are, and again, when our translation summed up, but it's literally headed up by love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
It seems that this is suggesting that love is sort of stating in the negative a sort of parallel to what verse 7 is saying, right? Give what is owed to those who are owed that. Love does not give evil. Love does not do wrong to those who are owed the status neighbor, those who are owed what neighbors are owed, is the way that I'm reading that. For those following in the Greek, it's to in the dative, plesion, using the accusative just from the previous verse that's quoting. So this idea that you have the accusative there either works as a quote of the verse, or the accusative is being used in a sort of an adverbial way. But the one who is to be treated as neighbor, the one who qualifies as neighbor, and that idea, I think, suggests to me that love is at stake actually in the previous discussion on authority, and that the previous discussion on authority is itself subordinate to the discussion of love that came before in chapter 12 and has now come back here. So it may be an excursus, but I think it's still sort of saying, now, how do you do this lovingly? Which also might suggest in that place where he says, don't do things just out of fear, but even more because of conscience. What he may be doing is not so much telling people, go along with abusive authority from wherever, but rather trying to ease the conscience of people who don't have authority themselves. He's talking to people who may not have a lot of autonomy, who may be slaves, who may not be able to control a lot of things in their own circumstances. They may belong in a household of a curious, a master, right, who is demanding things of them that they would not want to do. And so when he's saying, do this out of, not just simply out of fear, but out of conscience, he may actually be, trying to help people who are in an impossible situation, who don't necessarily have control over their own bodies, their own lives, their own circumstances in many ways. And so again, yes, I think maybe Paul is not always as aware of some of the things that people face, as I wish sometimes he were. I'm also thinking maybe what Paul is doing here is he's saying, this everything under the head of love one another basically means you treat everybody as neighbor, including maybe even those who are in authority over you. And if they're making you do things you don't want to do, that's going to disturb your conscience. Accept that they're in authority, if that helps you ease your conscience. In other words, don't. I think he may be trying to help people with that sort of difficulty that they may be facing. I don't know. It's a thought.
Interesting.
Trying to put it together.
Rabbi Paul.
I think really it might be good to view this portion we've been reading against Leviticus 19, where the commandment is quoted, and the situations are very similar. It's a chapter that has like over 50 mitzvot. Most of them have to do really with the life of the community in terms of relationship with each other. And I think at least Paul must have that in mind, because that is the context. And Yeshua must have had it in mind as well. And I think both of them are saying that you might miss it if you only read Leviticus 19, because there are a lot of mitzvot. You might miss it that the central one, the most important one, is to love your neighbor as yourself in these ways.
And who is my neighbor? You know, see, I know Yeshua talked about that. I wonder what Paul was thinking. Is Paul thinking again? You know, we're taking this whole argument started in chapter 9, really, and now 9, 10, 11, 12, now 13, all are about the Romans' relationship to Israel. So are we talking about this in-group? I call it, the in-group. Or is he talking about something more broadly, or is he talking about it all? I think Paul's mostly concerned about his immediate, which is to bring about peace between the Gentile believers in Rome and the Jewish ones, and the whole Jewish community, for that matter, the whole Jewish community. I'm reminded that at the end of the book of Acts, when Paul is under house arrest, he calls for a meeting with the synagogue authorities of the whole city of Rome, not believers, not believers in Messiah Yeshua, but the whole synagogue leadership of Rome. So Paul saw them as his brethren. He didn't see them as some unbelieving group of people. So again, I would argue that Nanos is onto something when he's thinking that a lot of this, at least, has to do with submission to those synagogue authorities that Paul himself subjected himself to. He clearly subjected himself to them himself. Anyway, why don't we finish this up? So let's see. We're going to take if you read 11 to 14 in the comment.
Okay. Do this, knowing the time, that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. The night is almost gone and the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Messiah Yeshua and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. A final plea in this chapter for a change of heart on the part of the Roman community. Now being a part of God's holy people, there is a new standard of life to which they must adhere. They are no longer a part of the world he described for them in chapter 1. Rather, they are now grafted into the Jewish olive tree, and as Israel has been, they must now be lights in the dark world in which they live.
Yeah. Yeah. So, again, this is, there's a shift here for me in Paul's art, where he now, narrows the argument to what he specifically expects from these Gentiles, that they no longer live in the way in which they once lived under normal circumstances. Carousing, drunkenness, blah, blah, blah. I've had the pleasure of visiting Roman cities when I was in Europe and places like that. I went to Ephesus. You want to see some place that's pretty awesome, and go to Ephesus.
It's awesome.
And they have public toilets. It's really wild, man.
Yeah.
These people knew how to go to the bathroom. That's all I have. They didn't just go to the bathroom. They had parties while they went to the bathroom. So, Paul was saying, listen, use a little discretion when you go, when you have to relieve yourself, it's a whole different way of life that Paul is calling these people into. And this is going to require an enormous paradigm shift in their way of thinking. So, all right. I don't have much more to say than what I said. Any last comments before we start tackling the difficulties of the 14? No? Everybody's satisfied? Do we got everything out of 13 that we needed to? Okay. Good. All right. Making progress. Maybe I could ask if he'll start us off on chapter 14.
Next page. The notes or the Bible?
No.
Next page. Yeah. Right there. Okay. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats. For God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. In this last section, Paul is calling the Roman congregation to unity in the Spirit. Essential to that unity is the appropriate attitude of the strong versus the weak in faith. In order for us to fully understand precisely what Paul is saying, we must identify exactly what he means by the strong and the weak. The first clue to this is found in what Paul says at the beginning of this portion. For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself, if then he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each measure of a measure of faith. Romans 12:3. And continues with his admonition. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Romans 13:8-10. Each one of us has a measure of faith specific to us, and that granted by God. Each one of us must respect that measure of faith given to the other. What is it that Paul means by using the term strong and weak? Joseph Shulam, in his commentary on Romans, describes it this way. He, Paul, uses the terms weakness and strength of faith in terms of the measure of faithfulness and love which each believer should exercise. Those who have the strength of faith to respect other people's commitments when they differ from their own, and those who do not have the strength of faith to accept alternate principles as being legitimate in God's eyes. In some cases, the weak have been identified as Jewish believers who desire to keep Torah. Their desire to do this being a sign to the Gentile believers that they are weak, considering their salvation in Messiah as inadequate. Thus, their need to do mitzvot to secure their salvation. I find this implausible for the following reason. Paul considers himself one of the strong. Does this mean he no longer practiced the kosher law and ignored the holy days? Biblical record and Paul's own words belie this possibility. Acts 18:18, 20:16, 21, 15-26, 28:17.
And more too, plenty more of those.
Oh, yeah. In all of these incidents, Paul demonstrates that he has remained a Jew, faithful to the covenants and commandments of God.
Okay. All right. What's happening here? What's going on?
Can I explain something?
If you must.
I must. First of all, we cannot take the text out of historical context and insert in a context some ideas what we have in 21st century. It's very
No
important.
anachronism, huh?
Yeah. So we have to go back to the history and discussion what they have. And we have to go back to the definitions of the Paul, what's the means to weaken the faith, what strong in the faith. Also, we need to identify what's the food in the definition of Apostle Paul and believers first century. So it's not the discussion about kosher, not kosher, what and biblical definition of food at all. So it's all every thing when Paul writing about food, he meant food by biblical definition of what food is. In this case, in a Roman society, meat, which is called food by God, go to the temple of pagans and be sacrificed in a pagan temple, and then go to marketplace. So some people who believe if this meat, this food, not what's not food, not pigs, not rabbits, nothing like that. Go to the pagan temple, it's unclean, and you cannot touch it, you cannot eat it. Yeshua, in this case, if you remember chapter 7,
Of what?
book of Mark,
Mark?
Mark 7, he touched this subject, touched this issue about, because ritually unclean hands, they eat the bread, and Pharisees start to judge them what they do. So according to their traditions, according to their views, religious understanding of the what's clean and unclean. And in this case, also in the Corinthians, actually, this subject also raised up about a food offering to the idols. And some believers from Pharisees said, consider this food, which was sacrificed in the idol temples, considered as unclean, and you cannot eat it. So it's the weak in the faith. Who's strong in the faith, following the teachings of the Mashiach Yeshua, which is expressed. If God called this food and sanctify by His word and separate from common, there's food is what it's Timothy chapter 2, I believe. Also, this subject, who is strong in faith and know the truth, they eat the food with blessings and thanksgiving, which is called food, without any judge about where it was, how you're gonna buy or anything like that. So it's a God sanctify this sheep or goat and call it food. You can eat it in Thanksgiving without any judging about who touched this or not touched it, because idols is nothing, and it's if God call it clean, it's clean. Is what I mean. It's I believe a chapter 2 Timothy chapter 4, or I don't remember. The same subject about it. It's related to this problem, because it was common thing in Roman society and Greek society in these days. But when you read the Bible, I want to repeat it again. When you read the Bible, if the Bible talk about food, it's a food according to the God's definition of what is food. It's nothing to do with pork, nothing to do with shrimps, nothing to do with rabbits, rats, cockroaches, and anything else.
Well, thank goodness for that.
So that's the pagan definition of the food in this case, not the church definition of the food in this case, not the Romans definition of the food. Because when Paul says believers, he knows what he says. And believers know what the food is. It was taught by Paul what's clean, what unclean, what food, and what not food.
And we have some other takes on this. Weak and strong. I see your hand up, Brandon. Is your hand up?
It was. Thanks.
Okay.
I think one of the things that gets connected with what Yaakov was just talking about is the discussion that of the question of idolathera, the meat sacrificed to other gods in 1 Corinthians, and there also we have Paul sort of dealing with the question of people's conscience, and though there we don't actually I think people import the weak and strong language here from Romans into that. So I don't know whether the food issues are the same or whether they're not the same. I think that might be an interesting but maybe not resolvable question. in terms of what the discussion is here. I think that one of the things about weak and strong is how the weak is characterized in our translation. Looking at verse 4, at chapter 14, verse 1, the translation that I think many of us are familiar with you suggest that the instruction is receive those who are weak in faith or weak with respect to faith. But the thing that is with respect to faith could actually not modify it could not apply not necessarily to the word weak, but could actually apply to the command receive. In other words, receive the weak with faith, or in faith. And their faith is not so much about like your belief in a thing or your belief in a concept, but actually with faithfulness. In other words, accept those who are weak with faithfulness. In other words, keep faith with people. And I think that might actually go back to a few verses earlier. It's nearer now than when we first believed. Well, maybe, but it's also when we first. The thing about having faith is actually much bigger than our sort of English words belief and faith often have meanings, right? This is about being in a faithful relationship, which can include sort of subordinating yourself for the good of the group. And so that might actually tie back to this idea of putting others' interests first. And so if Paul is now saying, hey, if you see somebody who you think is weak, welcome them for the sake of this kind of relationship where you're putting others' interests first, which is loving your neighbor as yourself, loving one another. What you owe to one another is only let that be only love to one another. So I'm wondering if we're starting the discussion of what weak and strong mean in a way that might actually, I don't know, but it might miss Paul's point if what he's actually saying is receive with faith, receive with faithfulness. This idea of the Greek word pistis rather than an English word belief might better be understood in terms of hesed, right? Faithfulness, the kind of faithfulness that that is extraordinary, but is also what is supposed to be normal, right? In the relationships that we have with one another and between us and God.
Thank you.
Interesting. The thing that confuses me about it is that actually I'm wrong here. Yeah. See, Paul couches the argument in terms of eating, what one eats and what one does not eat, which clouds the issue in a certain way. Because he's the one who makes it about eating. This distinction between weak and strong. He didn't have to introduce the idea of food into the weak and strong argument. He could have done it any number of other ways in terms of how people's faith. So I'm curious as to why he chose to use food as the, the background of the argument of weak and strong.
There's an old like a small story, I guess, meant to teach a lesson. Be the wolf you want to win, and internally, like if you feed the bad wolf, or your bad habits, eventually one day that wolf will win. There's always that analogy, it seems, of like feeding or of like food. So maybe if you feed your tendency to be loving, to be tender, to be kind, you will eventually reach a point where even when wrong is being done to you, you will repay evil with good.
Yeah. Yeah, except that there's so much background here, like in First Corinthians chapter 8, or the or Acts 15, in which these same issues are emerge. So I'm thinking it's more literal, I think, but I could be wrong. Rabbi Paul.
I found what Brandon said to be so incredibly helpful, because much like you're saying with in 1 Corinthians 8 through 12, and also as Yaakov brought it up, this idea of idol meat to be very prominent. But I think we create a problem. It's not that it may not be talking about that as being a pertinent living issue, just not being the heart of what Paul is addressing. It's almost like the Antioch incident in Galatians. People read that and suddenly here's one tidy illustration that becomes the grid through which some very, very prominent theologians have read the entire book of Galatians, I believe mistakenly, because it just is an illustration. And if you take this and you took it aside and say, it's not that it's, I agree with you, Tony, it's probably it may be idle meat here that he's addressing, but that may certainly be pertinent to us today. Giving one example, I don't know if people know this, there's a reason that it doesn't matter who makes vodka. It's always kosher, because what would be not kosher about vodka? Yet wine is kosher wine. And the reason is because if a Gentile makes it, you may be using it for liturgical purposes, using wine that was made by an idolater. Yet there's just as high a likelihood that you could have been made by a Jewish idolater if you're using it for Kiddush or for it no longer is the pertinent issue. But the overarching idea here, and I really like this, because actually the more normative way that you would actually read this in the Greek, well, let's just say it's a possibility, is to say, befriend those who are weak. And here I would say the are weak, you could amplify it by say those you perceive as weak, even though there's nothing that says that. Befriend those you perceive as weak because of your faith, rather than being oppositional. And I think that would be very pertinent to the world we live in today, where people are everything is so divisive. We can't have a friend. If you're a Republican, you can't have a friend who's a Democrat. If you're a Democrat, you can't have a friend who's a Republican, because everything you know about them is seen through that grid and through a particular, without understanding who they are or what makes them smart or dumb or weak or strong. And I think I think Paul here is addressing, and I think this makes it more consistent again with what we've just been talking about from chapter 12 to here, about the dominance of love in terms of understanding all things, because then it moves into the question of judgment and how do you judge others, and it could be flipped on its head. It could go either way. One more thing I would say is it just because it says the weak, because they eat only vegetables. let me just say that typically at home, we eat vegetables because my wife is a vegetarian. I've watched my wife go to endless retreats back before there was a vegetarian option, which even today is not very good. And I've seen her survive for days on stovetop stuffing and mashed potatoes because that was all that was provided for her. Certainly not weak. It was a matter of conscience for her.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that I think he's actually, Paul is being sensitive, even if the issue is idol meat, to those who felt strongly enough that they didn't want to go and eat the meat because it may have been sacrificed to idols. I think Paul could flip this argument either way as to who's the weak or the strong. I think what he's describing is genuine strength is of faith is being sensitive to others' needs.
You know, that's a great place to end this
Yeah.
study today.
Mhm.
We'll pick up this argument further next week because there are still some open questions about meat sacrifice, idols, and all of that sort of thing. So, because remember what they said in the Jerusalem Council, and Paul decided he would rule against that. So we'll pick that up next time when at our next meeting next week. So thank you all for being here. And thanks for this was a fun discussion, really.
Yeah, it was.
Enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, yep.
All right, friends, God bless you.
God bless you.
And have a Shavua Tov and an easy fast for Tisha B'Av. God bless.
God bless you.